Tell me that horror story. Worst financial model you've ever seen or had to work with?
Well, I think that goes in a couple of ways. One is the worst financial model I've ever seen from somebody else, and then another one, maybe the worst I've ever created.
You can go either way. It's up to you. We get a lot of both.
I'll give maybe a answer here from my own perspective of one of the worst that I ever created. And this is one that I share often, just the horror story of it, is I was working with a pretty high profile client several years back. I mean, quite some time ago. And I didn't really know the best ways to go about building recurring, enduring, flexible models where new data is going to be coming in. I always assumed that, I just have to spend hours and hours updating formulas and updating ranges so that I get all the most recent information in. But I remember I was bringing a bunch of new data in month after month and thinking everything was fine and that my analysis was reflecting all of this new information. And I got to a final presentation in front of the business owner and put that financial presentation in front of him. And he was like, "This is wrong." And I was like, "No, it's not." He was like, "Yeah, it is. It's wrong." And I mean, this was in the first few minutes. And I was like, "No, this is your data." He's like, "Maybe it is, but it's wrong." And I said, "Okay, well, let me go through the presentation and then I'll go back, check my numbers." And he was right. The model was in fact wrong. And I had just not thought of more effective ways to create flexible ranges and lookups. And I had presented a deliverable that it wasn't necessarily wrong. It was just way outdated, right? So it was like several months out of date. And he was the one who caught it. So it was just the embarrassment of building something that I thought was right, that somebody else who'd never seen it before knows that it's wrong. That was perhaps one of the more traumatic horror stories of my whole career.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've had to be like that where you make a mistake, somebody looks at it and they call it out immediately. I had one where I spent this time on a model, totally new idea. So I really didn't know how to build it, made my best assumptions. I'm in front of my boss, the CFO, and he's like, "This model looks like it's good enough for government work," which was not a compliment from him.
Yeah.
So you think about this, and just, kind of shredded it. And I had to go back and rebuild it. Yeah, it wasn't one of my finer moments. I can relate. I think we've all been there in different ways.
Yeah, and I think that the expectations are different from the person who's actually building it and the person who might be using it or collaborating with you. So, we use that statement too of good enough for government work is, what, it's at par or it's just subpar.
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
Good enough to get by, but for what we're trying to do, it's just not that good. And sometimes you don't necessarily know what good is until you see what somebody else's work looks like. And it gives you an impression of what you didn't know.
100% agree. I think that's been the most valuable things over the last few years as I started to really see different ways people model. I never had taken a modeling course. I just, you figured it out as you went. And I finally had one role where I worked with someone who'd been in investment banking, had built a ton of models and a boss. My modeling became much better. And then now doing this. And it's amazing when you start to learn from good examples and really see how flexible, how dynamic a model can be. You're like, wow, somebody told me what I made back then was good. What were they talking about?
Yeah, for sure.
What was your key takeaway from that experience? If you had to list kind of one takeaway, what would it have been?
I'm going to give you 1.5 takeaways. So
Sure.
One, always check your work, right? So don't trust that you've done it the right way. But 2, always try to, and this is perhaps the most important, I think, mindset that anybody can have is always try to think about where you're trying to go. Before you start to build, always trying to think about what are you trying to do? Where are you trying to go? What might this need to be a few months from now? And the reason why I say that is that oftentimes, Paul, if you came to me with some mandate, I would say, okay, I'm going to get that across the finish line and then I'm done. But if I'm not thinking about what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, what you might be asking for a few months down the road, that's going to give me a very different framework than Carl, I just need you to get this done in the next couple of days. And so to me, it's always been, since that moment, that was probably, 15 years ago. From that moment going forward, it's almost always about asking these clarifying questions of, Paul, I understand what you're trying to do, but how does this fit into what you're trying to do in the long term? Or, what's the business going through right now that I should be thinking about that maybe I'm not thinking about as you've just asked me to do this project? So long-term thinking, like long-term strategic thinking of where does this thing need to go is the biggest lesson of all.
It's funny that I think that kind of gets back to a little bit of what we talked about in FP&A, one of the most important skills, that ability to anticipate, right? You're thinking long-term. where could this go? What could they need? Yes, you can also ask them, but some of it is also your experience being able to say, I'm pretty sure this is where it's going to go. I'll make it flexible enough to manage that. Because sometimes they don't even know where it's going to go. You just know they're going to come back and ask more questions.
That's right. And thinking about that, it might just be an answer of, oh, I need to make this thing flexible, or I need to be open-minded about this, or I don't want to, put a bow on this right now because it's going to evolve. Just that anticipation of where things might go or that things might change is super important.
Agreed. All right. So this next question is to have a little bit of fun, because you provided a unique answer on Calendly when I asked what I should know about this interview. You're having it look like you don't remember this.
I don't remember.
Well, I asked the question. It says, when you schedule the meeting, one of the questions we asked on the form was to share anything that would help prepare us for this meeting. You provided a one-word response. Do you know what that word was?
I don't.
Donuts.
Oh, okay.
You care to elaborate on that? Let the audience in on this little secret of ours?
Yeah, I don't even know how this little inside joke started. I really don't even remember.
I think you told on LinkedIn the story when you were in high school.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
How you worked in a donut place. And then I did a LinkedIn post where I listed all the people that came up on my feed that are like you.
Okay.
And I put the word donuts on. I said lover of donuts on it.
Right.
I think we've kind of gone back and forth since then.
Yeah, so where that all started from, so when I was 13 years old turning 14, my parents lived just down the street. I mean, walking distance from a cider mill. And that cider mill was just very well known, very famous, extremely popular in the area. And people would go take their kids and get cider and donuts. And my very first job when I turned 14, my dad was like, go get a job. And I was like, where am I supposed to go get a job? I don't have a car. He's like, where can you walk to? And so it was either a choice of going to work at the cider mill. I think there was maybe a market a little bit further down the road. But I was like, okay, I guess I'll go there. And I went there and they were like, the only thing that we would ever hire you for is being a donut bagger. So we would put you in the basement with like the sweltering hot steam and lard. And I mean, it was not the most enjoyable experience. And yet friends and family members like, oh, you get to be around all those delicious apple cinnamon donuts. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you must love those. And I was like, no, I won't eat them. And I didn't eat them for like 20 years before I got that job. So it was just kind of always been this running joke of, oh, these delicious donuts. And I wouldn't eat them for like decades. But now, I've gotten over that donut trauma, maybe perhaps the same way that I got over the lack of dynamic data trauma. You learn your lessons, you move on, and you embrace the next chapter of your life. So I'm back to enjoying donuts again.